national television debut. Please join me in giving a real nice welcome to Mazzy Star.
Mazzy Star created music that felt timeless. They were quiet, mysterious, and almost allergic to fame. Yet they managed to leave a mark on an entire generation. But what no one knew was that behind the music, David Roback and Hope Sandoval were battling something so heartbreaking. Something kept pulling them away from the world. And in the end, it led to a painful tragedy that marked the end of Mazzy Star. The formation of Mazzy Star. Mazzy Star became one of the most legendary bands of the 90s. The kind of group that could stop time with just a single song. But behind that delicate sound was a band built on chaos and friction. And while Mazzy Star made everything sound effortless, the story of how they came together was anything but simple. In 1988, the band took shape in Santa Monica, California, evolving from an earlier project called Opal, a psychedelic rock group led by David Roback. Roback had already carved out a name for himself in the underground music scene, and before Opal, he'd played in Rain Parade, one of the key bands from LA's Paisley underground movement, a revival of 60s-style psychedelic rock that valued atmosphere over attitude. But when Opal's original vocalist, Kendra Smith, suddenly left the band mid-tour, Roback found himself at a crossroads. But fate stepped in when Roback met Hope Sandoval, a shy 20-something with an old soul and a voice that could melt through fog. She wasn't famous, not even close. She had been in a small folk duo called Going Home, quietly writing songs that sounded far older than she was. But she was a fan of Roback's work. One day, she handed him a demo tape as a genuine act of admiration. And while it could have been a moment that went nowhere, it changed everything. Roback listened to it and heard something no one else had quite captured. A softness that wasn't weak, and a kind of melancholy that felt natural instead of forced. He reached out to her, curious to see what might happen if they wrote together. And the result was instant chemistry. Roback had this cinematic ear for melody. Slow burning guitar lines, and reverb-heavy tones that shimmered like heat waves. And Sandoval's voice slipped right into that world. This pairing became the heart of Mazzy Star. Around them, other musicians came and went, helping fill in the edges of their sound. Drummer Keith Mitchell played with a steady, patient touch, giving the songs a pulse that never rushed. Keyboardist Suki Ewers added these delicate textures that made the music glow from underneath, while My Bloody Valentine's Column O Tsiosoig later joined in to add layers of soft, ambient rhythm. Every part mattered, but none of it tried to overshadow the core duo. The focus always came back to their strange, hypnotic connection. Their debut album, She Hangs Brightly, came out in 1990. It didn't explode on the charts, but it quietly carved out its place in the music scene. Tracks like Hala and Blue Flower introduced the sound that would become their signature. But critics didn't quite know what to do with them. They weren't grunge, they weren't pop, and they definitely weren't trying to be cool. But the real turning point in their career came with the release of So Tonight That I Might See in 1993. Fade Into You became the song that defined an entire era. It captured something so raw and timeless that it ended up everywhere. Late-night radio, movie soundtracks, mixtapes, and bedrooms. It climbed to number 3 on Billboard's Modern Rock chart and cracked the Hot 100, peaking at number 44, an incredible feat for a band that sounded like they were playing from another dimension. Everyone wanted to know who this band was, and more importantly, who Hope was. But as much as the world fell in love with their music, behind the scenes, things weren't as serene as their sound. Behind the studio doors, the band quietly wrestled with creative friction, long silences, and personal battles that would eventually shape and shadow the fame. Creative tensions and industry pressure. Mazzy Star's success might have looked effortless from the outside, but within the band, things were far more complicated. From the beginning, Mazzy Star seemed uninterested in fame. They rarely appeared in interviews, didn't chase radio play, and avoided flashy press cycles that other artists used to build hype. For most bands in the early 90s, getting on MTV or talking to Rolling Stone was part of the job. For Mazzy Star, it was the opposite. Their presence was quiet, almost detached, and that silence became part of their identity. Fans were drawn to the idea that this band existed slightly out of reach, in a world of its own making. But for their label, Capitol Records, that reclusiveness was a nightmare. The executives wanted something to sell, and Mazzy Star wasn't giving them much to work with. The band refused to appear in glossy photo shoots, skipped interviews, and preferred to let their music do the talking. A beautiful concept, but not an easy one to market. When Fade Into You exploded, the label expected the band to capitalize on it with appearances and promotion. Instead, Mazzy Star seemed to retreat further. David Roback and Hope Sandoval were often described as existing in their own universe. People close to them said they communicated in glances, more than words, with long silences that others found uncomfortable. But it made perfect sense between them. They were deeply protective of their creative process, which made collaboration feel sacred but also fragile. In interviews, when they did happen, journalists often remarked on how closed off they seemed, answering in short, careful sentences as if revealing too much might disturb the balance that held their music together. However, while this intensity fueled their art, it also created tension. David Roback was known for being meticulous in the studio, perhaps even obsessive. He could spend days on a single guitar tone, chasing a sound that only he seemed to hear. Sandoval, meanwhile, had her own vision, which was deeply emotional, instinctive, and resistant to being directed. The two respected each other deeply, but creative respect doesn't always mean creative harmony. Recording sessions could stretch endlessly, and disagreements over details sometimes left songs unfinished for months. Their perfectionism made their music timeless, but it also made progress painfully slow. Capitol Records grew frustrated with the band's pace. Years passed between releases, and when asked about it, the group never seemed in a hurry to explain. For executives, that was infuriating. They wanted singles, tours, and momentum. But Mazzy Star wasn't interested in momentum. They were interested in mood. The label tried to nudge them toward a more commercial direction, but both Roback and Sandoval quietly refused. They knew exactly what they wanted Mazzy Star to sound like, and they weren't going to compromise that for chart positions or sales figures. Still, that artistic stubbornness came at a cost. The band's live performances, while atmospheric, often divided audiences. Some fans adored the stillness, the way Hope Sandoval would sing without moving much, her eyes often hidden behind her hair or the brim of a hat. However, others found it frustrating. Critics called her stage presence aloof and distant, saying the shows lacked connection. But Sandoval wasn't being cold. She was being herself. Performing wasn't about theatrics for her. It was about preserving the feeling of the songs. Unfortunately, in an industry built on spectacle, that subtlety was often misunderstood. Touring added even more pressure. Mazzy Star's shows were famously unpredictable. There were stories of canceled performances and sudden schedule changes that left promoters scrambling and fans disappointed. The mid-90s saw several tours cut short, and rumors began circulating about tension within the group. Some pointed to Roback's perfectionism, others to Sandoval's reluctance to perform. But the truth was likely somewhere in between. Despite critical praise, Mazzy Star found themselves trapped by their own biggest hit. Fade Into You had become one of the most recognizable songs of the decade, but it also overshadowed everything else they created. Critics labeled them a one-hit wonder, which couldn't have been further from the truth. Their albums, especially Among My Swan in 1996, were filled with deeply layered songs that revealed new emotions each time you listened. But once the media pinned that label on them, it stuck. The pressure to follow up their success only pushed the band further into retreat. And so, while the rest of the alternative scene of the 90s was exploding under bright lights and MTV exposure, Mazzy Star quietly faded into their own kind of shadow. The industry wanted them to be a product, while they just wanted to be artists. Between the constant expectations, creative strain, and unrelenting scrutiny, the quiet space they once worked from began to feel suffocating. But the real weight wasn't just professional. As the years went on, what happened off stage started to matter more than anything the audience ever saw. Behind all the music and mystery, both Hope and David were fighting personal battles that fame couldn't fix, and struggles that would later define the heartbreaking legacy of Mazzy Star. The dark side of fame. Perhaps the most heartbreaking challenge Mazzy Star faced was the fact that they both never fit the mold of a rock star. In fact, David Roback, for one, walked away from success once, in the early 1980s, claiming that he felt a sense of limitations in his band. This move said everything about him. Roback wasn't interested in fame, and the moment something began to box him in, he slipped quietly out of it. Sadly, this pattern never really changed. Even as Mazzy Star grew into a defining act of the 1990s, Roback stayed almost invisible. When journalists or record executives tried to get close, he seemed to vanish into the background, content to let Hope Sandoval stand in front. But even she wasn't exactly comfortable being there. It got so bad that some collaborators quietly admitted that working with him could be exhausting, especially because he demanded an emotional precision that few people could maintain for long. But despite his quiet intensity, Roback wasn't just a dreamer sealed in a studio. He had a deep respect for other musicians and often reached out to help them shape their sound. Between Mazzy Star projects, he contributed to Rainy Day, a loose collective of musicians from the Paisley underground scene, and produced for other artists. Yet even then, he kept his name small. Hope Sandoval, on the other hand, had a more conflicted relationship with fame. While Roback hid behind his privacy, Sandoval was forced into the spotlight, a place she never wanted to be. She suffered from extreme shyness and stage anxiety, and performing live often left her visibly uncomfortable. She preferred dim lighting on stage, sometimes asking for almost complete darkness so the crowd couldn't see her clearly. While this added to the band's mysterious image, it didn't sit well with everyone. Offstage, Sandoval was even more outspoken about how much she despised the expectations that came with fame. In interviews, she called the music industry's obsession with image and self-promotion torture. She hated the idea that artists had to turn themselves into personalities to be heard. But this refusal to engage came with consequences. Labels grew frustrated. Publicists didn't know what to do with her, and there were even rumors that her quiet demeanor masked arrogance or resentment. The industry expected quick releases and constant visibility, but Mazzy Star moved like time didn't apply to them. They worked slowly, methodically, and only when the music felt right. But that same silence that made their art pure also made them targets for speculation. Fans began to wonder if they were drifting apart. The label worried they were losing momentum. And underneath it all, the emotional weight of trying to exist on their own terms began to take its toll. By the late 90s, Mazzy Star's public presence had almost completely dissolved. Hope withdrew even further from the spotlight, eventually forming her own imprint, Rhymes of an Hour, to keep full control of her music. It was her way of making sure no one could push her into anything again. Roback, meanwhile, continued producing quietly, staying almost invisible. The dreamlike world they built together had started to feel like a refuge from everything outside of it, but also a cage they couldn't escape. But eventually, all that silence, secrecy, perfectionism, and pressure began to catch up with them. The dream they had built was starting to crack, and without warning, the music that once united them simply stopped. And what came next was a long, heartbreaking hiatus that no one, not even their most devoted fans, fully understood. The heartbreaking hiatus. When Mazzy Star released Among My Swan in 1996, fans didn't realize it would be the last time they'd hear from the band for more than a decade. The album had the same wistful beauty that defined their earlier work, but underneath the surface, something was wearing thin. The long recording sessions, the pressure from the label, and the emotional drain of living in a constant haze of expectation had taken their toll. It wasn't an official breakup, but a quiet drifting apart that felt heavier than any public split could. After years of working in near isolation, both Hope Sandoval and David Roback seemed ready to disappear from the noise. The exhaustion wasn't just creative, it was existential. The very things that made their music so special, the perfectionism, the refusal to conform, and the insistence on total control, had also made it almost impossible to function inside the machinery of the music business. They were artists built for solitude. Yet solitude was also what slowly pushed them out of view. By the late 90s, Mazzy Star had simply fallen silent. Fans speculated endlessly, but neither Roback nor Sandoval offered any answers. The truth was that both had grown disillusioned with the industry and its relentless need for visibility. For Hope Sandoval, stepping away didn't mean stopping. She began channeling her creativity into a new project, Hope Sandoval and the Warm Inventions, alongside Colum O'Tiosoig, the drummer from My Bloody Valentine. The partnership allowed her to work without compromise, far from the commercial expectations that had haunted Mazzy Star. Their debut album, Bavarian Fruit Bread, was released in 2001, and it carried that same unmistakably Hope signature. Slow, haunting, and intimate, but with a more personal edge. Her voice, still soft and deliberate, felt more grounded, like she was learning to breathe again after years of holding it in. Unlike the massive machinery behind Mazzy Star, the Warm Inventions operated quietly and independently. They recorded on their own terms, released music through smaller labels, and avoided the endless cycles of marketing and touring that had once drained her. In interviews from that period, Sandoval made it clear that she valued the simplicity and the freedom to make music without having to constantly explain it. As the years passed, she returned occasionally with new material, most notably Through the Devil Softly in 2009, another collection of sparse, dreamlike songs. Her work during the hiatus wasn't a reinvention, but a continuation of the same spirit of Mazzy Star. David Roback, meanwhile, retreated almost completely from public view. While Hope was still quietly releasing records, Roback was composing film scores and producing behind-the-scenes content to stay in the background. Occasionally, small traces of his work, from collaborations to soundtrack contributions, would surface. They were subtle hints that he was still creating. But there was no major comeback. For fans, the silence became its own kind of story. The band's name continued to appear on mixtapes, in movies, and among new artists who cited them as an influence. Fade Into You had become timeless, but for all its lingering presence, the people behind it remained ghosts in the machine. Finally, after nearly 15 years of silence, Mazzy Star finally resurfaced with some brief reunions and collaborations, but it was clear to fans that nothing was ever the same. Brief reunion and collaborations. In 2011, word quietly spread that Hope Sandoval and David Roback were in the studio again, working on new music. For longtime fans, it was almost unbelievable. The band that had vanished after Among My Swan was suddenly alive again, older, calmer, and completely on their own terms. Their comeback album, Seasons of Your Day, arrived in 2013, 17 years after their last release. It wasn't designed to be a chart hit or a grand return. It was simply Mazzy Star being their most authentic self. The record sounded like time hadn't touched them. Hope's voice was still soft and detached. David's guitar still floated like smoke. And together, they recreated that dreamy atmosphere that had defined their best work. But beneath the familiar sound, the songs carried the weight of age, loss, and reflection. It was as if they were revisiting their past, but through a dimmer light. Fans noticed how Seasons of Your Day felt both nostalgic and final. Critics praised the album for its sincerity, and although it didn't try to reinvent Mazzy Star, it reminded everyone why their music had meant so much in the first place. In 2018, they released Still, a short EP that served almost like a final chapter. It included new material, alongside reworked versions of older songs, bridging the gap between who they had been and who they'd become. It was just 4 songs that carried that same late-night mood the band had perfected decades earlier. Listeners could feel how personal it was, almost as if they knew this might be the last time they'd record together. Mazzy Star's reunion wasn't about touring or publicity. They performed occasionally, choosing a handful of shows that felt meaningful rather than commercial. One of their most notable appearances came in 2019 at a festival in Mexico City, which would turn out to be one of the last widely documented performances of the band. The crowd was filled with fans who had grown up with Fade Into You, hearing it on old CDs, film soundtracks, or playlists, and now, decades later, we're seeing it performed live. The set list mixed old and new, featuring classics like Blue Flower and Look On Down from the Bridge, songs that felt even more emotional with time. What stood out most was how little they had changed. Hope still performed in dim lighting, barely speaking between songs, her voice steady and distant. David stayed to the side, quietly directing the sound. There was no attempt to modernize or rebrand themselves. They stayed true to the same understated style that had made them legendary in the first place. Even though the band never officially announced a breakup, the silence after 2018 spoke volumes. There were no more albums, no statements, and no tours. Hope returned to her work with the Warm Inventions, continuing to release music independently. Her collaborations with other artists, including Air, Massive Attack, and Kurt Weill, showed how respected she had become in the alternative music world. Yet, every project carried a trace of that quiet and emotional Mazzy Star mood. For fans, each new appearance from Hope or David during that period felt like a gift. And their final release, Still, ended up feeling like a farewell. Although it wasn't labeled as such, its tone said everything. What no one knew at the time was that Still would be the last music Mazzy Star would ever make together. Because soon after those performances, everything changed. David Roback, the quiet visionary who had built the foundation of their sound, would suddenly be gone. And with him, an era of music that could never be recreated. David Roback's tragic death. When news broke in February 2020 that David Roback had died at 61, The reaction across the music world was one of shock and quiet heartbreak. For years, he had remained almost completely out of sight, living privately and rarely speaking to the press. So when the announcement came, it felt sudden, like a light quietly going out, in a room people had assumed was still glowing. His family later confirmed that he had passed away from metastatic cancer, and with that, one of the most distinctive creative voices of the 90s was gone. David was survived by his wife, David Roback, his brother, Stephen Roback, and a sister, Diane Roback. For many fans, Roback wasn't just another musician. He was the architect behind a sound that had defined a generation. His music didn't age. It lingered, suspended somewhere between the past and the present. And so, losing him felt personal, even for people who had never seen his face or heard him speak. That was part of who he was, the invisible force behind something unforgettable. Hope Sandoval, his longtime creative partner, was silent for several days after his death. When she finally spoke, her message was brief and raw, a small glimpse into a private grief that words could barely touch. She shared a statement on her Facebook page which read, "It's been a few days since I lost my dear friend, and I am devastated. Thank you all for the love. Love, Hope." Alongside her statement, she shared a short poem dedicated to Roback about friendship and loss. It was the kind of tribute that felt completely understated, heartfelt, and stripped of anything performative. The poem read, "What will we do now? Now that you leave me here, even though the dark blue sky is still radiant and filled with the comforting sadness that holds us together. What will we do now, as you've been embraced away? Did I stay behind and not notice? Did you leave a quiet message somewhere? And I forgot to hear it. Good night, my beautiful friend. Please come back when the hour is sound." For those who knew the band's history, the loss hit even harder. Hope and David had been inseparable in the creative sense. They were two artists who communicated more through music than conversation. Their relationship had been complex and, at times, strained, but it was always rooted in deep mutual respect. The music they made together was born out of a delicate balance of Hope's vulnerability and David's precision. Without one, the other couldn't exist in quite the same way. Roback's passing didn't just end a life. It closed a chapter that had defined Mazzy Star entirely. Tributes poured in from across the industry. Musicians from every corner of alternative rock and psychedelic pop spoke about how much Roback had influenced them. Susanna Hoffs of the Bangles and Steve Wynn of the Dream Syndicate, both of whom had been part of the same Los Angeles Paisley underground scene in the 80s, remembered him as a visionary who had quietly shaped the movement from behind the scenes. They described him as thoughtful, disciplined, and entirely focused on creating something that lasted longer than trends or fame. Younger artists who had grown up listening to Mazzy Star also joined in, crediting Roback for shaping the emotional tone of the 90s alternative sound. Even those who never met him seemed to feel like they knew him through the music. For the fans, Roback's death brought an abrupt and painful realization. Mazzy Star was truly over. The band had never officially broken up, and in the years before his passing, fans still held out hope for another project, another tour, maybe even one last song. But with David gone, that possibility vanished. Hope Sandoval has continued to release music through her own projects, but she's never indicated any plan to carry on the Mazzy Star name. The band had always been the sum of two people, and without one, it couldn't exist. But the grief among fans wasn't just about losing Roback, it was about losing the sound he created, the subtle magic that had defined so many moments in people's lives. When Roback died, it felt like those memories lost their anchor, and the silence that followed his death echoed the band's own long silences. Even now, years later, there's still something heartbreaking about it. Roback had spent most of his life avoiding fame, and in a way, he managed to leave the world the same way he lived in it. Quietly, privately, without fanfare. But the music he left behind remains. Every time Fade Into You drifts through a film scene or plays late at night on the radio, his influence lives on. When David Roback died, it wasn't just the end of Mazzy Star, it was the end of an era and a reminder of how fragile and rare that kind of artistry really is. Perhaps the most tragic part of Mazzy Star's story was that fans never got closure. There was no farewell tour or final statement, but Hope's silence after his passing wasn't a mystery or a statement. It was just the natural continuation of what they had always been, and maybe that's what made Mazzy Star unforgettable. Some stories don't end with noise. They simply drift away and never truly return. Why do you think David Roback and Hope Sandoval were so private? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.